if we can start out, and how would you describe critical edtech? You know, what is unique about it, maybe to someone who's external to the field, or just when you describe your own work?
Yeah, no, I was always taking a critical lens because I was always really interested in what was actually happening, not what I was told was happening. So the big thing I think I wrote early on was this idea of looking at state of the actual, not state of the art. So I guess from the beginning, I always saw it as looking at the bigger picture, not just looking at technology and learning. And most edtech research looks at learning. And if it doesn't look at learning, it looks at teaching. And I wasn't really interested in that. Sometimes I said I was interested in education and technology and society. So I guess in a broad way, I've always been interested in looking at education and technology in terms of its social, political, cultural, economic, historical contexts. And I think that's probably how I would describe it to a kind of a newcomer to the field. It's not being an anti-ed tech. You often get accused of being a Luddite if you were doing this work in the 1990s. So it's not being against education technology, but it's possibly putting the claims and the promises of education technology under scrutiny. So being skeptical, but not cynical. And I also think we should try and remain hopeful, although there's clearly very little room for hope. So I quite like the idea of seeing the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is more than learning, more than teaching.
Thank you. And so kind of building on that before we start getting into more particular issues, is looking back, is there kind of one lesson or one key idea that you've learned that has changed? You know, you talked about how the framing is somewhat similar, but I'm also wondering about what has evolved in your thinking about this.
Oh, I don't know how my thinking has evolved, but one of the things I've always been is try to be open to being surprised. So never going in thinking that I know what I'm going to find. That's the big thing, I think. And also not thinking as a critical researcher that somehow you've got this unique insight onto something that no one else has got. It's very easy to think that everyone else is some sort of dupe and you've got the answers, because you haven't at all. And as soon as you speak to people, they're very, very clearly aware of lots of the limitations and the critical issues that you're also interested in. But I'm really interested in how people kind of, from looking at things from people's different perspectives. So always be open to be surprised. Always think about people's perspectives, but always try and think about context as well. That's one thing I've always tried to do. And there's a couple of questions I guess I've always tried to ask in my research. And one of the best ones is just, what is new here? Because so much about technology use in education is not new. We see inequalities or discrimination or harms. It's not new. They were there before. Technology might change things, but it doesn't make new things happen. So I guess those are the sorts of things I've learned over the years, and those are the sorts of things I still try and do.
Thanks a lot. So now I want to start maybe looking more closely at specific things. I'll try to share my my slideshow if that's going to work for a second. It seems to be hesitant about being shared. So we'll wait with that. Can you still hear us, Neil?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so the first subject we wanted to start discussing more specific issues, and the first one we want to talk to you about is something you've been working quite a lot about in recent years, and that's the issue of datafication in education. And I think we started off by talking about how you not state of the art, you said, but actually state of the actual. So datafication seems like such a logical idea. I don't know, for people working within or looking at education from the outside, everything is so messy, it's so hard to learn. So we should have more data and have, you know, better informed decision making. So, but what have you found in your own work? What are the certain gaps between this idea and how it plays out in practice, or what we should be looking at when thinking about datafication?
Oh, well, I could go on about this for a long time. First of all, is the phrase itself, datafication, is not anything that really makes any sense outside of academia. So when you talk about datafication, it really confuses people. So, I mean, the idea of turning everything you can into data and using that data so everything can be known. So I guess it's kind of the promise of big data, which has really come on leaps and bounds over the past 10 years with the rise of kind of complex computational processing and data storage, you know, the rise of AI as well, but also this idea of lots of data being generated in all these contexts. So we now have classrooms where the devices that we use are generating data all the time. We've got sensors, we've got all sorts of ways that data are being both generated on purpose, but also generated just as a matter of course. So it's a really kind of seductive promise, this idea of datafication. Dave Beer is a great researcher on this, and he talks about the data gaze. So the idea of being seen through data, and to lots of people, the promise is, you can know everything. He talks about speedy, comprehensive, prophetic, panoramic, smart ways of knowing. There are problems to this in any context, but there are particular problems in terms of education. So the two things I'm interested in is looking at these two problems of reductionism and representation. Representativeness is really interesting. Can everything be represented through data? Because there is this idea that if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And, what measures is what counts. So I'm really interested in how things are turned into data in education and how these representations perhaps limit what we might know about a classroom or might know about students or might know about anything that we're interested in. And I think there's lots in education that cannot be reduced to data. And there's lots where even when it is reduced to data that can't be represented, there's a lot that gets squeezed out. So that I think is the really interesting questions to ask. When we think about education in data form, what's reduced and what's lost altogether? What doesn't count? When we've done research on this, there's heaps of stuff we've found. One of the most interesting things is when you talk to teachers about data, they get really interested because teachers are told that they have to know all the time about data. There's a big push in Australia, there has been in the States, and I'm sure there has in Israel, about being data-driven. They talk about data-driven instruction, data-informed decision-making in the class. Teachers are really focused on data. But when you talk to teachers about data, they're talking about something very specific and very different to what I was interested in as a datafication researcher. So teachers are really interested in knowing things about the students that they work with in their classroom. And they're very interested in generating data about those particular students. They'll give out online surveys or quizzes or the, attendant. That's what they mean by data. So when I talk about trace data, the data that's generated by the technologies that we have, or when I talk about learning analytics, teachers' eyes just glaze over. They're not interested in that type of data at all. So there's two lessons to be learned there. The logic of digital data, learning analytics, digital dashboards, trace data, doesn't wash. Teachers are not really interested in knowing everything. Teachers are not really interested about long-range predictions or looking over historical trends. And I'm really interested about how the organizational logics of schooling kind of prevail. Teachers are very focused on the here and now, dealing with the thing that's in front of them, not knowing about what might happen in 5 years' time. So those anticipatory logics don't really play out. And also, teachers are not at all interested in digital data that's generated by technology, which is bad news if you're interested in learning analytics, and also bad news if you're interested in things like data privacy and the kind of more critical things that I was interested in. So that was actually kind of a real eye-opener. Teachers think a lot about data, but not the types of data that we think they should be thinking about. So it's a huge issue, but there's, again, a lot of hype and a lot that's lost in this turn to data as a possible solution.
Thanks. That's very interesting. You kind of the gap you mentioned between what we talk about in research or what the datafication is assumed to mean and what teachers want. And I think if I could ask you a bit more about that, I think one of the themes that sometimes comes up in your research is how datafication actually looks at the school level. When we go to the school and see what kind of data they collect or how it's organized, I think sometimes it looks very different from what we imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, it's the same in every other, well, not every, but same in lots of other organizations. So one of the things that struck us in our recent project is we went into one school and they said, oh, we're doing all this predictive analytics. We're predicting where students' grades. And it sounded great. And when we actually spent some time with them, we were taking an ethnographic approach. There was one teacher in the school who was a kind of data expert. He had some statistical knowledge and he was using Excel. So basically everything he was doing was on an Excel spreadsheet. And what he was trying to do was to work out what grades the students could be predicted to get, and then using it as a way of kind of scaring them into working harder. But the way that he predicted the grades, he had data from examinations for some subjects, but there were other subjects that he said, well, the examination data isn't, I don't trust it for this, for the humanities subjects, for example, or for the social sciences. And then he would literally go and talk to each individual teacher and say, what do you think Gideon's going to get in his final score grades? And then he would write that into the Excel. So it was completely human led. It was all based on relational, it was kind of very relational practice. And it was basically one teacher talking to other teachers and then presenting it to the students as, the computer says you're going to get a distinction, you could work harder. So it was all done very, very low tech. And in some ways, I was really pleased about that because it was teachers taking control, exerting their professional expertise, not being led by the technology, but making the technology work for them. But on the other hand, it was a complete charade. It was kind of this like Wizard of Oz, there was a kind of lots of humans behind the scenes working furiously. And it was using Excel, which is the lowest level. But also when you read the data, NASA, a lot of NASA work is done on Excel. A lot of work in the military and a lot of work in big business is done on Excel. And that's why actually so many data related mishaps occur. So yeah, the realities of data were really messy and grubby, but rooted in the context of the school, and actually happily rooted in the context of education as a human-led relational process that wasn't just about, numbers and context-free predictions. And I think if schools can continue doing those sorts of practices, then perhaps there's hope. The danger is when it gets kind of given over to an automated system and there isn't room for that one teacher to go and talk to his colleagues and put numbers into Excel and fudge things. That's my concern, the automation of it all. But at the moment, schools are just doing what they normally do.
Thank you, Neil. That's fascinating, that example about how we end up working on Excels. I have one quick follow-up question on that. To what extent do you feel that this lack of working with data is organizational? You talk about the school as a school context. If they just had more teachers, had more time or more funding or more technology, or are there aspects that do not stem from these kind of organizational problems, but are rather inherent to teaching or to the education?
Yeah. Well, when you do any research, the answer is there's not enough time. Teachers need more time. And the other answer always is everything is led by assessment in schools. So you need to change assessment. And those are just common factors in schools. And again, that's also why it's really worth looking at how the promise of technology hits the kind of reality and the practice of schools, and things that like time or lack of resourcing or lack of time to develop news become really, really important. And those are the things that shape education technology. I think we were interested, it wasn't organizational problems. We were interested in this idea of organizational logics. And so this is an idea from sociology about how organizations have certain types of logic around time and space and what's valued, and how these organizational logics shape any practice or innovation that comes into them. And so there are business type logics, for example, around how the organization works in terms of what it sees to be efficient, what it sees to be its kind of core goal. But there are also kind of more cultural logics. So one of the schools we were looking at was a Catholic school, and they thought they had a very pastoral, justice-led approach. And that actually shaped the way they use data. They said, we don't like to compare one person with another. We feel that's unfair. So we only ever tell people what the average is for the whole class, which really used to wind the students up because they really wanted to know who was top and who was bottom. But when you looked at a independent fee-paying school, they were very into competition because it would make the students, compete against each other and be harder. So those sorts of logics as well. And then there are the kind of professional logics that teachers have as expert. And that's a really important thing when it comes to data, because one of the professional logics in teaching is I am the subject expert. I am, I'm also the expert of the students that I teach. Nobody can know my students better than me. And we found that logic actually prevailing quite a lot. And that framed the way that schools approach data. They would always say, the data doesn't usurp the teacher. The data is always the beginning of a conversation, that the teacher can use the data point or the data, the analytics, as the start of a conversation with the student to actually kind of then have that professional interaction. And so those logics were very strong. And again, really good. I'm really pleased those logics were usurping, these data tools and these dashboards that the schools had. And if you look at, Larry Cuban talks about the grammar of schooling, which is a similar idea, that there are these architectures and structures that have grown up in school, even around time. That was really, I could talk about this for ages, but time was really interesting. So if you think about schools, the architecture of time is very much around the lesson, the school day, the school week, the term, and this academic year. And in terms of having just in time, always on predictions about, teachers weren't interested in that. They said, we want to be able to know the data at the beginning of the school year and then just before the exams, and we don't care what happens between them. So even time is very structured in schools in a peculiar way that it wouldn't be in a business, or it wouldn't even be in a university. And those things, again, really shape the way the technology is used and really shape the way that the promises of digital data play out. And unless you understand the context of education, you can't design good technologies that fit, and lots of the technologies are not even designed with education in mind. They are business tools, or they're tools that are designed for, the best case scenario, designed for higher education. And as soon as you put them into a primary school or secondary school, they just lose all of that. So yeah, I think it wasn't organizational problems. It's just organizational logics, or just the realities of what schools are like as an institution. And you'd expect that if you take a critical approach.
That's fascinating. I actually find that a bit encouraging, because I think one of the worries would be that teachers would just get the data and be done with it. And you're saying the obvious, you saw the opposite, that they're using it and they're actually relying on their own judgment. I want to connect that to kind of a related issue, the issue of automation in education. I think you were talking about the logic of education as a context. So I'm wondering if you can just maybe share quickly what you mean by automation, or an example or two of how it affects or maybe reshapes education, and how we should be thinking about it critically.
Yeah, no, there are heaps of automations in education already. We try not to talk about AI in our research. We talk about automated decision making. And there are so many different uses of computers, where computers are used to process data in order to, apply rules or choose the best course of action, or generally determine what happens in classrooms and schools. And so there are lots of examples of this at a government level or a state level. There's all sorts of examples of data-driven decision making, governments making decisions about where they should build the next school, or how they determine school budgets, or how they even determine giving grades to students who haven't been able to sit exams. That was one thing that happened in the UK over the COVID period. And at the school level, at the classroom level, there are lots of little systems that make these decisions and monitor classroom behavior and actions and make decisions. So, there's all sorts of stuff. We've been looking at student activity monitoring software, which is used a lot in Australia now, which is software that is on all students' laptops, and it determines whether the student is on task or off task by monitoring their what they're doing on screen. Now, that's used to be something that a teacher would do. They would wander around the class and look at the student's computer and say, are they on YouTube or are they doing their work? Now there's software that does it and makes that decision, and the student will just flash red on the teacher's screen. You've got automated grading of essays, automated grading of tests. You've got technology that promises to be able to, chat to students in real time and make decisions about what they should learn next. Personalized learning systems. There are all sorts of tech. And the key thing for me, well, there's lots of key things actually, but this is not technology that teachers are using or students are using. It's technology that's used on students, or actually used on teachers as well. So it's a very kind of different thing. So it's there. It's not, you're not seeing teachers being completely replaced by these things. These are very small, very specific automations. But I think you're seeing kind of the automation of the classroom by death by 1,000 cuts. There are so many of these little things taking place throughout a day that you're gradually seeing the classroom and what happens in it less and less decided by the human teacher and the students, but more and more decided by the algorithm.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm wondering, how did the software decide who's on task and off task?
It's really interesting. Again, I could talk about this at length, but it's set up to monitor what you're doing on your laptop. So it looks at the tabs that you've got open on your internet site. And to begin with, the teachers can put in things that they say are on task. So actually, if you're looking at YouTube and you're looking at, I don't know, animals in Australia, I can say, well, actually, that's what we're doing for our class today. So if the kids are on animals in Australia, most of the time the teachers don't bother doing this. So the software generates a long list of things which it considers to be on task, and then it learns from being used across the school system. Often it will be fairly obvious if the kids are off task, because they'll be watching basketball matches or doing something else. But there are often these fine lines where it goes orange, it doesn't go red, it goes green. And that's where the algorithm really gets things wrong. So it's a very, very blunt tool, but teachers love the idea of being able to know at one sweep what 30 students are doing on 30 different laptops. So it tends to be used as a very blunt tool. What it doesn't do, of course, is the students know full well about this, and so they start using their second screens or their third screen. So we were really interested in how it was working out in practice. This technology was in schools for a long time, wasn't used very much until the COVID lockdowns, and our schools in Melbourne were locked down for 6 months. And then it became really popular because the teachers suddenly realized they could see what the students were doing at home on their laptops. And then it took off. And since then, it's been used quite a lot in Australia. But yeah, the algorithm that is developed is very, very blunt, very, very wrong. And the best teachers know this, and they won't suddenly start shouting at a student that's flashing red, but they might start having a conversation with them and then seeing exactly what they're doing. But there are obviously going to be situations where teachers don't have the time to do that or aren't technically aware, and will just take what the computer says as verbatim. And that's where the trouble lies. But yeah, fascinating. And, it's really fascinating how it takes hold as well, because the logics of schools and classrooms are very much based around monitoring, tracking, surveillance, discipline. And so these technologies kind of fit quite well the logics of the classroom. So you can see why teachers use them.
That is fascinating, and I wanna build on one of the things you said about the differences between different technologies as being used by teachers and students or used on, and I think that kind of moves us to the next thing we wanted to maybe discuss with you, and that it's the idea of different actors and power relations within EdTech, and something you have worked on, and I think it's particularly interesting in the Israeli case where we have a lot of high tech, and it's very well esteemed, and kind of in contrast to how people think about the education system. So I was wondering how you see the relations between different actors in EdTech, and have you seen these change over time, or maybe even post-COVID, and what should we be particularly mindful when looking at these relations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've said before that one of the questions I've always asked is, what is new here? Another question is just the usual political economy question of follow the money. Where's the money coming from, and where's the money going? And so I've always been fascinated in the way that commercial corporate interests are clearly inherent in education and digital technology. In the 1980s, governments and states tried to build computers, and some of them did. There was the British BBC computer. Sweden had its own computer. But very quickly, it became apparent that we needed tech industry to kind of build the devices and increasingly build the software, which was a shame in a way, because the 1980s, when teachers used to make their own programs, and there was a bit more of a kind of grassroots community feel to education and technology. But, 1990s onwards, we needed tech. And it was interesting, when I started, there were these international tech firms that were trying to sell things to schools, but they weren't doing it very seriously. And they certainly didn't think that, education was a very good market. I remember one American firm, that when we interviewed them, they said, look, schools are just a nightmare to sell to. You can't make any money from them whatsoever. And they always want things for free. We do it, but we don't do it very seriously. That's all completely changed. So I think we've progressed from this small ed tech firms, which were around the edges, part of a wider network of community and hobbyist teachers, to a domination by what we refer to as big tech, which is a bit of a misnomer, actually, because I think it should be big tech's plurals, because you've got the Amazons and the Googles and the Microsofts and the Metas of the world, but they're all in competition with each other. So it's not just like there's one big company. There is a network, as you said, of influence. But it's really, really interesting how these big corporations have their claws in everything now. You still do have these smaller companies selling things to school at a lower level. So there's a kind of ecosystem, but I think the big tech, the rise of big tech over the last 20 years is the big shift that I've seen. And these companies are part of everything. So if you look at Google or Amazon, for example, Google is selling Chromebooks to put into schools. They've got Google Classroom, the suite of all of the kind of online tools that schools can use. They advise on teacher training, for example. They sponsor academic research into education technology. They pay for, EdTech champions, and you can be an Apple Distinguished Educator. And companies like Amazon, for example, own the infrastructure, the broader infrastructure that everything is put on. So if you look at Amazon Web Services, now that cloud provision company, they own everything beneath it as well. So at each stage, big tech actors are really, really influential, and they influence government as well. And there's some really interesting things when you think about the logics of these big tech actors, as opposed to governments or, you know, civil society or other actors that might be involved. The big tech logics are very, very distinct. So for example, big tech will see everyone as an individual in a digital ecosystem. They're not really interested in institutions or schools or classrooms. Everyone is just an individual that can go anywhere and do anything online. Everything is scalable. That's another logic of big tech. They don't look to do things at a local level, but everything needs to be scaled up to a global level very, very quickly. Otherwise, it's not seen to be successful. And everything is modular, so everything can be plugged into everything else. And I think when you see those logics at play, and you see them at play when you look at any of these big platforms, for example, we've been really interested in how facial recognition is getting into schools. You can buy a facial recognition API, plug it into another platform, and all of a sudden your EdTech platform has facial recognition capabilities. These logics, I think, don't fit with what we think education is or public education is. You know, this idea of scaling everything up to a global level, one size fits all solutions, I don't think fits. The idea of just people being individuals that can just kind of surf around in a very kind of individualized way, that doesn't really fit with how we should be seeing the politics of education technology. So I think that's really, really important to think about. I've got a colleague called Tom Hillman from Gothenburg University, and he was talking about how we used to have technology in classrooms, but now we have classrooms in technology. So it doesn't matter if my classroom is being taught through, you know, a big platform, and your one is. In some ways, they're the same classroom. They're in the technology. The platform is now, and that's where we talk about platformatized education. And that's a big, big shift. So I think we really need to ask questions about who these actors are, but also about the logics that drive them and their activities. And I think things about scale and modular, all those things are really, really important. And just one last thing to say as well, we shouldn't get too fixated on the big, you know, FANG or GAFA or whatever you want to, the Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Microsofts. Some of the big actors now coming into big tech post-COVID are, say, huge Indian corporations. Byju's, for example, is the biggest ed tech company in the world. It's a freemium tutoring app valued at $22 billion, claims to have over 115 million users, and now is building 500 tuition centers in India. So it's actually building its own schools and its own institutions. It's huge, absolutely huge. The biggest company you've never heard of. So the money is global. It's not just Silicon Valley. It's not just, you know, Europe or Israel. It's India. What used to be China until a couple of years ago. And that's really interesting. If you're interested in how kind of education in the global south might be going, then companies like that are clearly not just going to be looking to making money from the global north. So yeah, really interested. Follow the money, think about networks, think about influence, and then also think about the logics behind how these people imagine education taking place. And it's often not how you or I, as educators, would like to think education takes place.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I have so many questions about individual, scalable, and modular, and having classrooms in technology. But I'm also mindful of our time, so I'll move. I want to ask you about something that you have been working on recently, and I think it's one of your most recent lines of work. You've been looking at the issue of the relations between EdTech and climate change. And I think this is an issue I haven't seen a lot of people work on. So I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about it, and what are your plans for developing this line of inquiry?
Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that. One of the things I've always tried to do, as an academic, I'm not gonna invent a cure for cancer, and I'm not going to, you know, change the world as a social scientist. So one of the modest ambitions I've got is to try and just change the nature of the conversation around technology and education. So having some form of kind of soft influence on policymakers or parents or whoever it is. And so recently the whole issue of sustainability has come up around technology in general. So it's not just an educational issue. It's not just something that's unique to EdTech, but given that we work in EdTech, we should think about how these these issues, how our work is implicated in this. So again, I could go on at length about this, and I won't, but we're becoming increasingly mindful that the technologies we use come at an environmental cost, environmental burden from, the rare minerals that are extracted to actually make things like my smartphone or your laptop, the power that is used to just, power data centers, and the carbon expenditure that's actually incurred by training an AI model, and all of the e-waste implications. All of these things are happening and mounting up. We've got, these burdens are disproportionately on global south, disadvantaged regions, et cetera, et cetera. So at the moment, we're happy to put up with that. And at the moment, at the very best, people are happy to kind of assume that there'll be a green tech fix, or we'll have clean technology or carbon offsetting, or whatever else the big tech industry is promising. My concern is that none of that's actually going to happen, and this is just going to get more and more of a problem. And the other flip side to thinking about climate crisis and Edtech is actually a lot of the climate events that are taking place, fires, floods, wind, are disrupting our ability to use technology. So when I first, 5 years into being in Australia, because I'm actually from Europe, we got an email around saying we're having bushfires and extreme heat, and it's causing our data centers to close down. Only use essential technology for the next week in the university. And I was just thinking, what the hell is essential? It's probably not me using my technology. Is it the science department? Is it the people doing it? And we've got a heart hospital on our campus now. Maybe it's the hospital. And it just got me thinking that actually technology is not abundant. It's not, we can't assume that we've always got always on technology. What do we do when we don't think about technology as infinite, but we think about limits? And there's all sorts of people outside of education thinking about this. There's a computing within limits movement. There's a digital sufficiency movement, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, long story short, how do we reimagine education and technology in a future where we don't have abundant technology, where we do have these climate events, and where we're mindful about the impact of our enthusiasm for technology on the environment? There's lots of things that people have become very critical about technology and education in the past 10 years, but there's a real blind spot in critical ed tech to think about the environment. Even the most critical of us assume that it will somehow be fixed by, Google switching over to carbon neutral data centers. I don't think that. We need to anticipate other futures as well. So that's something I'm beginning to get interested in. And it's a bit of a risk in the way, and because people don't really want to hear about it. It's a really difficult thing to get your head around. But I've only got, I'm an old man, as we established at the beginning. I've only got 15 years left. And if I'm going to do something useful for the future, this is an issue I think I want to just get people talking about. But my aim isn't to solve, I can't solve, this is not a problem that can be solved, but we just want to learn to live with it. How can we have a livable form of ed tech for the future? So, this might be the end of my career, because it might be a bit of a red herring, but I don't think it's not going to be a problem in the future. I don't think it's not going to be an issue. So we need to start talking about it. That's all.
Thank you, and thank you for that. That's really an issue that we often don't talk about at all in these kind of contexts. And I think maybe building out from that before we move on to questions from the audience, just kind of in general, your view. We have our first Israeli critical tech or interdisciplinary views on tech conference. How do you see the future of the field? What do you sense we should be looking at in terms of areas that are fruitful or underexplored, or even methods or ways to approach the questions that are the heart of critical ed tech?
Yeah, no, I think as a field of academic work, it's going to continue to rise. People never used to be interested in this at all. Years and years and years ago, when I first started doing this, it was a crazy thing to talk about. Everyone thought I was insane, because even very progressive people wanted to be very optimistic about technology. So we've seen this techlash over the 2010s, and people have become more aware of the issues around technology relating to power, inequality, and all the things that make critical ed tech studies, not just through education, but through things like the Edward Snowden revelations about government spying, Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism, the terrible antics of companies like Google and Amazon not paying tax. So there's all sorts of reasons that people are now skeptical about tech, and that has now coming into education. So I think as a field of academic work, this is definitely a fruitful area to be in for the next 10 years at least. and it will continue to rise in popularity. We're seeing more journals taking on these issues. We're seeing more critical EdTech studies appear in mainstream education journals. And we're also seeing critical EdTech studies appear in the broader social sciences. You know, it's a journal like Big Data and Society now will have education papers in, which is great. So academically, perfect. I don't think we can just do academic work and, you know, point out the problems about technology and feel smug about that. That's not really useful. So hopefully it will also morph into more publicly impactful work. And I'm interested in this idea of applied work. All right, we've got our critical insights. What can we do with them? And I think we're beginning to see more impact there. Policymakers are not stupid. They've been around for a long time and they're increasingly open to hearing critical perspectives. I mean, that thing you've got up on the screen now is a paper that Kerry and I did for UNESCO, Futures of Education. So you've got organizations like UNESCO, governments, for example, interested in areas, particularly in the sustainability and social justice areas. So if you look at the SDGs and, you know, the idea about SDG 4, there is a big awareness that technology often makes things less fair rather than more fair. So a lot of these organizations are very interested in that. And the other group of organizations that are becoming increasingly interested is teaching unions, all the things about technology as a workplace issue, as a labor issue. So you've got lots of people I think are interested in it. It'd be great to see more impact over the next 10 years in those spaces. I'd love to see more student activism and students being actually kind of supported to talk about technology in a way that is empowers them rather than impacts on them in a meaningful way, and teachers as well. So I think that's really useful. But it's important not to get caught up in reactionary pushback. There are other groups that are really, really keen to try and get rid of technology in education for kind of not very progressive means. There's quite a reactionary, conservative approach to getting tech out of schools. So actually my interest in the next few years is not just about being critical about EdTech, but asking about how can we have better EdTech? And that's not the same as having no EdTech. So I'm not dismissing EdTech, but I want better forms of EdTech. That's a value-driven statement, and it's all about values. And how can we get values of social justice, for example, or, you know, environmentalism or whatever it is into the technologies we've got? And if I was in the audience now and I was just starting out, if I was back being 23 all those years ago, I would be learning to program. And because I think methodologically, interrogating the code is all very well going in and talking to people and doing interviews and observations and the rest of it, but actually code-based studies are really, really important now. So having the ability to do a little bit of programming, to play around with APIs, to interrogate the code, to do kind of code-based studies, that's really good. And if you can kind of be a bit of a programmer and a bit of a philosopher, that's the sweet spot. And the best things I read at the moment are people who are computationally literate, critical commentators, people like Alexander Galloway or Wendy Chun, for example, or Benjamin Bratton. They're all programmers that can also do philosophy. I think that's really, really interesting. So yeah, if I had my time again, I would probably take coding and programming a bit more seriously, but from a critical perspective. But there's lots to do. So it's a great field. And if you can get it really going in Israel, that's fantastic, because there's loads of really interesting questions you can ask there. But I will shut up, and I'm more than happy to talk about anything you like.
Thank you. I don't know how happy I'm here about the advice to learn to code. Maybe it's a bit too late for that. And also not being smug is one of the few upsides of being critical, is being smug about it. But we'll now move to questions. We have some questions on the Padlet, but if other people have questions here, maybe you can either write them or just say them out loud, and I'll say them to Neil if he doesn't hear them. So the first question is about, you mentioned the involvement of big tech actors or transnational corporations in education, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. And your research, among other things, deals with the ramifications of technology on democracy. So considering the great influence of big corporations on education and political developments of the past few years, populism, post-truth, and so on, what are your thoughts about the relation between EdTech and democracy?
Well, gosh, that's a really big question to ask. Yeah, I mean, there are colleagues that are doing stuff on disinformation and misinformation in education, which is not an area I've looked at in depth, and maybe I should, or maybe someone else should actually. I'm interested in this idea of values. So I might, yeah, the work I've done on this maybe looks at values rather than democracy, but clearly the two things are linked. Clearly, technology has politics. I mean, that's one of the things that we've always looked at. And so there are values baked into the systems and the technologies that we use. And also those systems and technologies find politics that fit them. And that's that kind of Langdon Winner approach of, do artifacts have politics? That's something that's always really kind of pushed me. So I'm really interested in the values that surround educational technology. And in particular, it's not so much the kind of the politics of the big tech companies, but this broader mindset. And I'm still thinking about this, and I can see it's difficult to explain, but the idea there's maybe a technicist mindset, or Judy Weissman refers to it in an engineering mindset that kind of drives a lot of what technology related actors do and how they see the world. And also, I think this impacts on how they see public education. And sometimes it's very, very implicit. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in learning analytics, and how they imagine education to be is very much about how they learnt when they were engineering students or computer science students, individuals being tutored by a really amazing tutor. And that's how they kind of want to replicate the world. But I'm interested in how people that work in technology are animated. And I think they're animated by seeing things often as a problem that can be solved, so a solvable problem, and even imagining something as complex as education as a set of variables or processes within a broader system that can be manipulated. And it's just a case of kind of debugging the system or solving the problem that way. And I think that's really interesting. If you try and imagine the values of EdTech, but also just tech in general, from that perspective, you can kind of see how some of the problems arise when tech actors or EdTech actors try and think about social problems. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I'm not saying that it's wrong, because social scientists also think in a very kind of narrow way. And if a social scientist tried to design a piece of technology, they'd soon come into problems. So it's kind of getting and I'm not saying it's two sides either, but it's kind of getting those two perspectives talking with each other, understanding each other, and then maybe intersecting in the middle, which is kind of why I was implying earlier. It's really important for someone like me to learn coding, so I'm actually technically able to criticize something not just from a kind of social science perspective. But I think if you think about the values of technology as being driven by values of problem solving, values of efficiency, improving technical performance, generalizability or scaling up, then you kind of begin to think about the politics of EdTech in a slightly different way. And also what's not in those sort of values. And often there's a lack of thought, possibly, about the social or the political. And that vacuum kind of allows the problems that a lot of us point out possibly to happen, the centralization of power, or the harms that arise in terms of discrimination, or people being excluded. Because from a technical point of view, you need to discriminate, you need to label, you need to sort, you need to rank. There will always be errors. There will always be things that don't happen right. And that's acceptable. That's all part about making the program or the technology more efficient. But from a social science perspective, that's dreadful. That's one student that's life's chances have been ruined. It's not just a variable. So I'm interested in those technology values. It might be a technicist mindset or an engineering mindset or a computational mindset, but there's something going on there that's very, very different to a lot of the values and ways of thinking and the mindsets that we have in social sciences and in education. So that probably didn't make sense, but this is something I'm beginning to think that I don't want to stereotype, techies and non-techies, and but there's something there. I think there is something there that we need to talk more about and talk with each other more about.
Yeah, I think that framing is really interesting about looking at the engineering mindset versus the critical or social science mindset, and especially not the need to kind of integrate them and not choose one over the other. We have another question that's a bit thinking about learning analytics, and if you have any thoughts on the ways that learning analytics are used or maybe misused in higher ed versus how they're being used and misused in K-12 in schools.
Yeah, I got in a lot of trouble about learning analytics. First thing I'd say is that yeah, learning analytics seem to be really taking off in higher education. There does seem to be a kind of an appetite for them. We've not found an appetite for them in K-12 whatsoever, as I was explaining before. Teachers are very, very distrustful of learning analytics in a way that they're not in higher education. As I understand it, I don't think learning analytics are actually designed for teachers. They're designed for students. They're very much based around the idea of feeding back information to students and influencing their decision making. So that's kind of why they don't work in K-12, because K-12 is not about having these kind of self-responsibilized learners that decide what they do. It's very much the opposite. So if you're going to invest money, don't invest in K-12 learning analytics. That's my first piece of advice. But it's really interesting, the logics behind it. As I was saying before, you speak to a lot of learning analytics people, they learned they were very successful at school. They were very self-motivated. They were very individualized, and they really wanted to know what they could do better. And so it's very much designed for that type of person. When you talk to them about their theories of learning, I mean, that's a good question as well. What pedagogy underpins, or what theories of learning underpin the tech that's in schools or universities? Often there's no thought about learning or pedagogy. If there is, it's often behaviorist. But for learning analytics, it's very much around the self-responsibilized, self-regulated learner, the learner that makes decisions about their own learning. There's this kind of behavioral economics idea of the nudge as well. You just need better information, and then you can be, your decisions and your behaviors can be kind of nudged in the right direction. That works for a very particular type of person. It doesn't work for lots of others. So I think that's possibly why it's taking hold in higher education and not in K-12. But then I think there are all sorts of, I mean, I talked before about the problems of reductiveness and representativeness. There are so many things about learning that can't be represented in data, I think. And there's lots of stuff that is often reduced to a point where it's meaningless in terms of data. So that's a big, big issue. So I think there are also, I wrote a paper actually, I was invited to write a paper for, one thing about learning analytics is that as a community, they're really open to being told that they're wrong. So they invite loads of people in. They invited me in to do a keynote for them at their LAC conference called What's the Problem with Learning Analytics? Which is kind of why I laid out most of these arguments. Then they got 3 or 4 people to respond, to give kind of responses. And then they asked me to do a final response. They refused to publish that final response. They said it would disappoint their readers. So I actually got that published somewhere else. And that's kind of where I went a bit further and started laying into the lack of politics in learning analytics and the broader philosophical issues. So if you want to dig out 2 levels of critique, what's the problem with learning analytics was one of them. I can't even remember what the second one was called, but it's in the Internet and Higher Education as a journal. The great thing about learning analytics community, as I said, they're very open to talking about why they're wrong. They're very interested in issues of ethics and fairness and accountability and transparency. I get a sense that the steam is running out of that field, and they're moving their attention to AI and other applications of data science in education. I feel that they're getting a bit despondent about the pushback and just the slow way that education is to take things up. And because these are very bright people who can do anything, apply data science to any domain, I get a sense that their attention is wandering slightly. So if you look at someone like George Siemens, for example, who was one of the kind of the forefathers of learning analytics, he seems to have really kind of got bored of it and has changed his attention to AI and, all sorts of other, complexity theory and all sorts of things. So yeah, maybe the intellectual steam is running out of learning analytics. And what we're now seeing is a load of really kind of low level, dull dashboards being kind of plugged into learning management systems. And yeah, so it's an interesting field. But yeah, read those 2 papers if you want to see my thoughts, and try and get that second one as well, because that was I was quite interested in that, because one of the things I was arguing there is that learning analytics has very distinct politics, and unless you accept that as a fact, you're kind of, it's always going to reinforce the status quo. They didn't like that sort of critique, so fair enough.
Yes, there's a limit to everyone's responsiveness to the sort of critique. So I have a question stemming from AI, but maybe I want to open it up if there's anyone who wants to ask a live questions, not through Padlet.
In terms to the literacy of the students who see the for example, in the streets, walking to the fountain, and and don't have too many people read a novel of 100 pages today. And the question is, will see us people about promoting Edtech, coping with the new literacy that it is really the lecture literacy that the students are coming with.
Could you hear that, Neil, or should I repeat it?
Well, I could. It sounded like you were underwater. So
Okay.
if you could just repeat it,
Yes,
I could
the
hear there were
question-
words.
I'll try to repeat the question. The question is about the changing children's literacies. That is, children they don't come into school as they used to. You know, they're on their phones. They consume different types of media, and they're probably less likely to read a long novel. So, what as looking at from an EdTech perspective, what can we do, or what should we do about that?
Oh Lord, that's a huge question, isn't it? I'm interested. I was going to talk about different forms of digital literacy. In terms of reading, I mean, the great thing about this area is there's so many different people now doing work in it that there are really good people looking at literacy and EdTech. So I'm probably not the best person to ask. I would push you towards some of the other people that are doing some great work in this area. One of the best people I know about digital and literacy is Mark Warschauer in UCLA. He does some great stuff. You did some great stuff on the digital divide, but he's doing some really interesting stuff on literacy and digital. So definitely look at Mark's stuff. I'm interested in the fact that we've now got students coming in and what we can teach them about digital literacy. So I can talk a little bit about that. And also how we can perhaps get them thinking a bit more critically. So there's this push towards critical digital literacies, which is quite interesting as well. And this is not actually going to answer the question whatsoever, but I'll say it anyway. We had this kind of 20 years of we need to teach kids about technology. They're coming in with technologies, but they're not really kind of literate in use, et cetera, et cetera. What's quite interesting now is how do we do that in that context when I talked about technologies that you don't use but are used on you. So you don't do the technology, but technology is being done to you. So there's a big push now about critical algorithmic literacy. And I think schools are really important places to allow students and teachers to think critically about AI or about automation technologies. And that's very, very different. You don't just sit a kid down in front of a computer and say, right, use a facial recognition system or use machine learning. It's more about awareness, just getting students to actually be aware that the technology is in the background doing things to them. And then having some form of basic understanding of the logics of how it works. You don't actually have to be an expert in AI, but it's good to know about what the algorithm does, how it processes your voice, how it decides whether you're on task or off task. And then there's a couple of things we can then do to support students to either have strategies to work with that technology or possibly work around it. And then also tactics to perhaps obfuscate or escape it, if you see what I mean. So there's this really interesting thing about awareness, basic levels of understanding, working with, so it works in your interests, working around, and then working against. And so when we think about how can schools help teach students to be literate about technologies like AI, like ChatGPT, for example, which I'm sure none of you want to talk about, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Students being being aware that a piece of text has been written by AI, understanding how that's happened, perhaps using it to their advantage as a creative tool, but then actually working out how they can work around it and then perhaps actually resist. So that's what I'm interested in terms of literacy, digital literacy. What does digital literacy mean in an age of AI? So that's got nothing to do with reading books or writing chunks of text, but I think we can use all these things creatively. So even with something like ChatGPT, I would love to see used as a creative tool, and then also use schools as a place to help students learn about the limits of the tech-based literacy practices. And read Mark Warschauer's work if you want a better answer.
Thank you so much, Neil. I think this is kind of a good point to finish at. We have a critical literacy and then working with and against, and maybe what you called an optimistic view. So thank you so much for coming for that.
No, that's great. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope the rest of the day goes really well. It's a really, really interesting event. So I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much.
No worries. See you soon. Ta-ra.
Bye-bye. אז כמו שמריה אמרה, חמי אמר, סליחה, המושבים הם עוד רבע שעה בבניין 71-2. אנחנו, או אחד מהמקומיים, או אחד מהעוזרים, יעזרו לכם לעבור, כי אי אפשר למצוא את זה לבד בחיים. בעיקר אם אתם צריכים מעלית, המעלית הקבועה תקועה, אז נלך מסביב, ואני חושב שגם העברנו את האוכל לשם, כדי שיהיה לכם פחות מוטיבציה להישאר כאן, ושנספיק להגיע. זהו, תודה.
אבל גידי, אני חושבת שלא נהיה במליאה עד
כן?
אוקיי, אז אנחנו נגיע לפה באמת רק במושב האחרון. כל היום המושבים יהיו בבניין 70 בבית הסטודנט. ארוחת הצהריים מתקיימת באותו בניין, קומה אחת למטה, בקומת הקרקע, בקפיטריית כפיות. הם יודעים שאתם הולכים לבוא, אתם יכולים או לשבת